friend. The kind of friend who likes to poke their nose into mysteries that perhaps ought to be left. Oh, you do? Well, here is a story for your friend, be he called Dunning or Wilberforce, or in this case, boast of no finer name than Smith. An old friend of mine who came visiting me here in the wild Pyrenees and insisted on going to a little city, one of the smallest in France, but not the smallest, common here. A city that is little more than a cathedral, calling to the highs and the lows, Sir Bernard de Commingas, down in a pass over to Spain. He visited me first and asked whether I had ever been, and I said, no, I hadn't. I was happy poking around my particular edge of the wild. But he said he must go. I will give it to you as he told it to me. And so I went south of Saint-Gaudens, and there, sitting on the knees of the Pyrenees, it was a jewel. A perfect 14th century cathedral. It seemed to be untouched by time. The very saints were painted. Well, I went in. I needed to have said before I let him go that I had agreed to come in the evening. I know these churches. Half an hour does me. And I know the hotel there. They do a fine dinner. More of that later. So I contacted the sacrosanct. I suppose you might call him a deacon, but I prefer sacrosanct. And very willingly he said, Monsieur, my time is yours. And he took me into the cathedral, and I told him I was going to be hours, and perhaps he wanted his dinner? And he said, no, monsieur, I have had my déjeuner, and I will have my dinner later. My time is yours. So, I can't begin to describe the joys of that cathedral. Please don't, I said to him. There was a painted portrait of Mary of Magdalene with eyes so bright. The cathedral, I learned, had been built by a certain Canon Albert, who had a reputation for not being entirely honest. So the sacrosanct had told me, and so I saw in the church records. He seemed to be very fond of raising tithes, and not all of them were his own. I examined those, so great was the detail. I examined the stuffed crocodile above the high altar. I looked at the candles. 13th century, I reckoned. Very valuable. Here, in the land the revolution never came to. And as for the painted saints, I would take a week to describe their wonder. Oh, please, do not bother. Well, but all the time, there was the little sacrosanct at my elbow, and he seemed so jumpy. I wondered if he was scared of me. But then, as I was admiring the crocodile, suddenly I heard it, up there in the belfry. A weird, queer noise, like a laughter, but not of anyone sane. And the sacrosanct seemed to jump out of his skin when he heard it, and mutter and take a cross. out of silver and press it down. And again when I was admiring the sculpture of Mary Magdalene. Again he jumped and was close by my side, looking always up at the belfry. I suggested we go there, and he said, no, monsieur, no, it is dangerous. The floorboards are rotten. And maybe that's true, I don't know. Although I seem to hear heavy footfalls up there. Perhaps it is the town sanatorium, I thought then. And then as we were going out, he turned to me and said, Monsieur, perhaps you would examine our local books? We have in the library one for sale that might interest you. And I thought to myself, here comes the rub. I am going to be blackmailed into buying some dreadful saltier of the 17th century that looks valuable and isn't. I know these sacrosancts of old. But he led me to the back room, where I suppose it was his daughter, welcomed me, and he whispered to his daughter in French, Louis, avec la cloche. Je l'ai attendu. Or some such nonsense. And I wondered at it. But they gave me a very fine local wine and some coffee and some bread, and they sat me down. And then he brought out this book. And I looked at it and I thought, yes, I thought so. Binding 17th century. It'll just be a psaltery. And I opened up the first page. But to my shock, it wasn't printed. It was written. Perfect unseal. Couldn't have been later than the 15th century. And it said, in Old Latin, the scrapbook of Canon Albert as he bequeathed the church. And as for the bounding was a lot later, and even this white paper was later. And I opened it up. And straight away, I was lost in history. It seemed to be a lost epistle of Paul, the apostle, to Hispania. And it opened up another side of the prophet. Where it was from, I don't know. It had clearly been stolen, I thought, for its edge was ripped. And I remember there was an allusion to some sort of text that had been lost in the 14th century, up in Paris. And then I turned over the next page, and there was a beautiful manuscript, all jewels, with a style of writing from the time of Charlemagne. Again, barbarously pasted with some dreadful horse glue into this book. And I turned over the next page, and priceless, there was a page of a lost gospel of Mary of Magdalene. And as I was reading, I was aware that both the sacrosanct and his daughter were on my shoulders, breathing hard, as if willing me not to turn over. And as I listened, it seemed I could see and hear the dark listening. So I turned quicker than I might have done, not being one to oblige. And there was a strange picture. I suppose it must have been from the time of the canon himself, 14th century by the design. Solomon casting out the demon, but Solomon looked scared, and the man who the demon was coming from looked terrified. And as from the demon, hunched, spider-like, but still a man, eyes wild. The picture doesn't exist anymore. But with its fangs, and its eyes, and its form, all you could say about the picture is it looked like it was painted from life. I shivered to see it, and I closed the book quickly, and as I closed it, there was one of those strange, muffled now, laughs. And then the sacrosanct turned and said, "So, monsieur, vous achetez notre livre?" And I knew what he was asking me. And I said, quel coûte? And he named a price. 100 old francs? Really? But that was nothing. I tried to offer him more, but he was adamant. He had bought the book for the cathedral, he said, for 100 gold francs. And for 100 gold francs he would sell it. Now there was something shifty about him. I wondered where, in what vide-grenier he had bought the old book, to return it to the cathedral, and why he wanted to give it up. But I bought the book. You don't often see the lost gospel of Mary of Magdalene. And then he turned to me and said something very funny. Monsieur, you will not go home alone. And I said that my friend was coming that very evening, might even be in the bar of the hotel, because I knew him quite well. But before I was allowed out, his daughter came with a silver cross, and she said, "Pour vous, monsieur." I poured, Louis. And she put it on me. It was a silver cross. Not the kind of thing I would wear. But there was something in her voice that made me keep it. Well, I went back to the cathedral, and actually, I hadn't turned up. The carriage had been delayed. I was only going to be another 15 minutes, and I'd left a message by telegram. So I took the book up to my room, and I pored over it. But it was funny. However I turned the pages, I always came back to that same image of Solomon and the demon. And I sat there looking at the demon long, when suddenly I felt a prickle down the back of my neck, as if something was behind me, and I turned. And at first I thought it was some sort of giant, 5-legged spider. And its legs started to move, and as they moved I realised it was a hand. And I turned, and I looked up, and there behind me, yellow eyes, starting, mouth too narrow to be a human, and a voice, less than a man, more than an animal. I felt its cold breath. Just then, just as well, I knocked very loudly on the door, and I opened it, and I found my friend gibbering. He was pointing to a foul picture, and he'd already started to tear it. Well, that's the kind of thing to give anyone nightmares, so I threw it in the fire then and there. And we agreed before the night was out we would sell the book for 100 old francs to the University Library in Cambridge. So, if you ever go to that library, perhaps you will find the book. Perhaps you will find more than the book. But if I have done my job, you won't go at all. You'll give up curiosity and just stay in the bar.